Hello everybody, warm welcome to this S&OP MasterClass from Perito Consulting. My name is Søren Pedersen and I'll be your host for this podcast. The purpose of these S&OP Masterclasses is to give you some insights into how we work with supply chain planning with our clients and hopefully give you some tips and tricks, some perspective that you can use in your own supply chain planning and improve the performance in your companies. Today's topic is a follow-up on our last podcast where we discussed that supply chain professionals really need to do something different, need to have a new perspective on supply chain management if they want to succeed in the future. And today we're following up, getting a bit more hands-on, giving you 7 steps on how you can actually get the basics right if you want to make a transformation in your supply chain planning. And again, today I have invited my very good colleague, Stefan Sørensen, into the room to give his perspective and his experience in these 7 steps on the transformation. Warm welcome again, Stefan.
Thank you very much.
And again, it's not everybody that has listened to the first podcast, so just to benefit for everybody, could you just brief introduction, who is Stefan and what's your experience?
Sure, thank you very much. So I have a background in business consulting and ERP implementations and business intelligence and planning solutions. So I've worked with that basically for 20 years. So I have a wide range of experience, both from the business side, but also going all the way back to the nitty-gritty details of IT implementations.
Perfect. So you're seeing a lot of companies wanting a transformation, and let's see what your view is how to fix that. Before we dive into the 7 steps, which is basically the basis of this podcast here today, I think it just for the listeners, again, it could be good to just have a quick recap into why it is that we think that a change is due in many supply chain professionals' view on supply chain management.
Sure. So you can say, operations has always been has had a focus on efficiency and optimization, etc. But there's a huge difference in optimizing, driving down a straight road without too many bumps, and then optimizing your supply chain in a situation we've had for the past, let's say, 3 to 4 years, where there's been the COVID crisis and now recently the scarce access to capital, etc., inflationary pressures and so on. So, and we talked about the last podcast that basically from a supply chain perspective, going from almost a pure delivery performance perspective to also looking very, very hard on the net working capital side, that basically from a supply chain perspective corresponds to turning the wheel 90 degrees left or right. And maybe that's just the new normal, that we'll see a lot more of these 90-degree turns from year to year. And basically, we need to set our supply chain, both processes and IT solutions and organizations, into a mindset where they are able to do that without having to do projects every time there is this 90-degree turn. So your systems and processes need to be basically adaptive to these changes in focus and
Yeah. So basically, we established that change is due, and of course, you at home, if you want to dive more into that, we have another podcast who to really broaden out that topic. But let's set the scene here. Then I think 2 things you said last time that we set off on today is 1, just get started, not wait, but get the basics right. And it's the basics right that we really try to dive into today, because if you're a supply chain professional, where to start is the big picture. And even though we really advocate that you should just get started, not wait for your next ERP system or whatever, then we also say at the same time that you have to do the right things. And I know you have prepared like 7-step plan here to make that transformation. So let's try to dive into that and what to do in practice here.
Yeah, and I'm sorry if after we've gone through the 7 steps, the listener might not think that this is nothing new. This is not rocket science. But the reason why we're bringing it up is simply because we've seen it done wrong so many times in our experience. So what we've seen done wrong is basically we've seen supply chain organizations basically go into a state of paralysis. This paralysis coming from the fact that maybe their ERP landscape is not as they would like it to be, so they need to do a re-implementation of their ERP landscape. Maybe they're in a constant firefighting mode, which is not unusual for operations, constant firefighting mode, and they never really think they have the bandwidth to move to this next Shangri-La of processes where everything is IT-driven and rule-based, etc. Or they might have trouble with their master data, so we really need to clean our master data before we can start any roadmap on the road to a more efficient supply chain. So all of this corresponds to a state of paralysis, and that's basically what we're advocating to get over and simply get started. But I think the 7 points will basically tell you, okay, what does it mean to get started? What do you need to get right from the start? And again, like we did in the last podcast, I would say point number 0, so it doesn't count, but the point number 0 is that you need to be very realistic around whether you're able to drive this process on your own or whether you need assistance from an external party. And the reason why we call it point number 0 is that we know that it's very self-serving coming from a potential partner to say this, but you really need to know whether you have access to the right capabilities. And the right capabilities both being on the business consulting side, being able to go in and analyze your operating model together with you as a client, but also understand the very technical side, because as we also mentioned in the last podcast, this is very much an IT-driven exercise as well. All of the enablements you're gonna get in this new journey for your supply chain is going to be enabled by IT and solutions that fit in with your existing landscape. So find the trusted partner that can take you basically spare with you on all the different areas of these initiatives, and then it's also important to treat it like you would do when you select a new ad agency, for example. So see it as a partnership that goes the next 4, 5, even longer years, because this is a journey and it's not completely well defined from the beginning what type of initiatives you're gonna do. So you need to have the mindset that you have a partner who can help you on all the different areas if you don't have the capabilities in-house. Yeah. So should we get started?
Yeah, let's dive in to the first point here, being okay. Where do I, as a professional, start here?
Yeah.
First steps.
And I would say the first step, it might not be so intuitive, but I would actually say that it's very important for the business on their own, before they invite any partners in, to try to describe in their own words, with their own understanding, what are their view on their current operating model, what's the status, and where would they like to go. So listing all the different obstacles, etc., in their own perspective before they invite anybody in, and try to document that, because it's easy to lose track of what their own view of the situation is as soon as external parties enter the game. So I say that's an important step. Number 1 is try to describe and prioritize your own view on your current and your future operating model.
Yeah. So how would you go about doing that in practice? You would invite in, of course, a stakeholder, but is it fixed on the pains of the supply chain at the moment, or the where we perform best, or how would you?
It's basically a bit of both. So both describing objectively does our operating model, what principles are we driving our operations from? What simple things like what is our footprint like? Why are we producing in these sites and distributing via these sites, etc.? Is there any obvious ideas on how to make our footprint of factories and distribution centers, etc., more efficient? Is there anything with our product portfolio that could be sanitized, etc.? So all these initial ideas before anybody externally enters the room, try to describe that in your own words. And where would you ideally want to be in 5-10 years with your business? Of course, taking into account all the different other strategies in your company, like sales strategies, R&D strategies, etc. So you need to have a full holistic picture of your business.
Yeah, and I guess also one thing I stumble upon quite often is that you also need to involve the C-level here in that, because what are at the moment the critical business values that we as a supply chain need to attend to, and our outcomes need to follow. So I guess you need to have that perspective. Is it still profitable growth, or is it capital, or what is it that really is the key drivers or service levels, whatever, for our business in the next 1, 2, 3 years down the road?
So obviously on top of the ideas for the operating model, both now and in the future, you need the direction from the board of directors to basically indicate what their what their view is. So you're not coming up with some pie in the sky strategy.
Yeah, but sometimes it might actually be a good idea to ask them, because surprisingly enough, in my experience, some companies, people guess, and it might not be right.
No. So keeping alignment with your board along this journey is, of course, extremely important.
Yeah. So step number 1, do your homework.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
Then point number 2 is, and this is basically going back to our methodology as well. Yeah. So typically when we engage with a new client, I would say 90% of the cases, because we must recognize that the client base can be in many different maturity levels. But the model here actually works in all cases, even if it's a very advanced supply chain or whether it's a fairly low level of maturity supply chain. But the point number 1 is basically to conduct what we call a pre-study. And that's, of course, easy to say, but we'll get into the details of what that actually is comprised of. Basically, a pre-study is a bottom-up analysis of your supply chain. So not just a fancy management consulting analysis with which delivers a PowerPoint slide deck at the end that you can take to your board and present. It's basically a very data-driven analysis of what's the situation in our supply chain at the moment. And the pre-study basically covers 5 different functional areas. Of course, you can always discuss whether it should be split up even further. Yeah. But now we'll highlight the 5 different areas. Area number 1 is the demand planning side. So basically diving into what is our current, because no matter whether you think you have it or not, you have an approach and you have a demand plan, or an approach to a demand plan, and you have a demand plan today, whether it be an Excel sheet that's done in sales or in finance or in operations by themselves, you have a demand plan. So what's the accuracy of that, and how's it performing, and what are the principles behind it? So basically, are we planning by customer and material, or just by market and material, etc.? And what's our methodology for doing the demand plan?
So and I guess when you say demand plan, then if we talk about the pre-study or the analysis that we conduct here, what would you dive into there? Is it like, how accurate are we in predicting our sales, or what are the dimensions here that you should?
The way we approach it is basically to go in and try to do a competing demand plan. So with our principles, our methodology, etc. Of course, educated by the methodology that the customer is already using. Then we'll try to do a demand plan and see if we can push the level of forecast accuracy even higher than they have today. Both introducing and generating ideas for new approaches, new methodologies to do the demand plan, but also to verify that how mature is the process actually, the current process they have today. It also reveals, and that's the same for the other points. It also reveals exactly how mature is your current IT landscape. So your ability to deliver data to do this bottom-up driven material by material demand plan. How well are we able to generate that quickly? Will tell you something about your maturity on the data side. But of course, most importantly, it will indicate whether you have a significant potential in this increased forecast accuracy or not.
And I guess one thing, of course, is how much can we improve things. But I guess it's here that's also really valuable insights into and explanations. Why are we here today? So is there just an example, seasonality that we are not picking up, or something in our data that's wrong, or in the behavior that comes from the demand planning analysis as well?
That will also be uncovered in this pre-study. It will also uncover one of the hot topics in demand planning today is demand sensing and the use of machine learning, etc., introduced in the demand planning process, where the clients in general don't have the maturity level to do it on their own. Then we would be able to, or another partner would be able to introduce new ideas, new methodologies to show whether it would actually be able to add to your forecast accuracy in general. So all of that would go into the analysis. And again, to highlight, this is a bottom-up analysis going into the detail. It won't deliver it won't only deliver high-level results. It will actually tell you exactly what products you have issues on, etc.
Yeah.
Then if we move to the second functional area, I should reiterate that we're talking about 5 functional areas within the pre-study.
Yeah.
The second area is to analyze your vendor delivery performance, because as we've seen, especially in the past 2-3 years, there's huge difficulty in most supply chains on the supply side. And historically, we've had a lot of focus, a lot of man hours going into the demand planning side. But the reality is that if the supply side is fluctuating wildly compared to our master data in our system, lead times, etc., then that can have at least or even more impact on poor performance in your internal supply chain. So not just delivering a report of your vendor delivery performance, but also analyzing what type of issues, what exact vendors, what product or component classes are you having specific problems on, etc., to generate ideas. And that's of course the analysis part, but there's also the part that goes into idea generation on is it possible to integrate our processes even deeper into the supply side? So meaning sharing forecasts. That's an obvious that's an obvious point. But how far can we go in that integration? And that of course depends hugely on what the supply landscape looks like from a certain client point of view. Do we have 2,000 suppliers and are we a small player in their view or a big player? So all of those considerations goes into the analysis to generate ideas for the future supply chain strategy.
Yeah, but I guess here you also get a data-driven view on your suppliers' performance.
Because it's important to state that everything we do in the pre-study is data-driven. Yeah. So all ideas generated will be pointing to a specific analysis in the pre-study.
So a benefit here would be that we as a company might have a perception on our supplier performance and lead times and things like that. But here you actually, if you perform this type of analysis, would get hands-on knowledge. Are we correct? And how much does it actually fluctuate? So I'm going away from gut feelings to actual data on things.
Especially on the vendor performance, the obvious analysis is to go in and look through the past 2 years purchase orders coming in from vendors. What lead time, what's the variation in lead times, etc., and how can we use that information in our internal optimizations? Because as we do with stock optimization on the demand side, we look at our ability to foresee the demand fluctuations when we determine the optimal stock levels. But at the same time, we're also able to look downstream to our suppliers and see those supply fluctuations should also be taken into account in the optimal stock levels. Yes. Then the third functional area within the pre-study is basically an equivalent analysis of the internal delivery performance, and not the internal delivery performance, but our performance against our customers, which is also important, because that goes into the fourth functional area, which is basically stock balancing. So for stock balancing, you of course need a stocking strategy, which is basically based on a targeted service level. And to set a targeted service level, you also need an idea of what is actually the realized service level we currently have against our customers. Mm-hmm. And are we having low performance in general, or are we having low performance in the past year because of certain situations? So we need that whole basis for decision making when we go into point number 4, which is the stock balancing part. And then for the stock balancing part, it's important to state that the situation has changed quite a bit in the last couple of years, as we touched in the previous podcast, where the focus is hugely on how much capital we have tied up in the stock, and less on the delivery performance. Of course, the delivery performance is still hugely important, but now we've equally as much focus on how much stock we have tied up. And even some customers have specific sort of thresholds or ceilings on how much are they allowed to tie up in stock from their board.
So basically, if you're looking for a silver bullet for C-level and especially CFO attention, this is the area that you should focus on. I think virtually every CFO we talk to at the moment have this attention towards the inventories and how much cash, of course, we're tying up at the moment.
And depending on how far down you go into this pre-study, you can go into the whole stock balancing analysis. You would go in and prescribe certain, you could say, stock. Reduce the stock you've tied up and from different initiatives, like what's our strategy with regard to maybe sanitizing our product portfolio, simplifying, because as we know, we've come from a situation where we could basically sell everything, and that has a standard effect that your product portfolio will grow in complexity, and of course the supply chain just has to keep up. But now that the focus has shifted to focus on how much capital you've tied up in stock, then the supply chain is sort of left with the bill. and part of the solution there is basically to sanitize your product portfolio, maybe which will subsequently sanitize your need for components in the other end.
So what you're saying is that in many of these analysis towards the inventories and the stocks, you will also see some recommendations of going from a situation where everything is made to stock, basically, let's just get it in, that we will have a number or a series of our products that will be made to order, that just we're changing a service level, we're not promising as much to the clients, so we're just making in once they order here now.
Yeah, so it's basically revisiting the whole tail of products which is closer to not being profitable now than they were 2 years ago.
Yeah.
So that's just point number 1. But then we have also, of course, an obvious one is to scrap or sell off stock to simply get the net working capital down. That's an obvious one. Then we have the next point is the ability to, maybe if you have a multi-level supply chain, returning excess stock from your downstream locations. Some organizations, they already have a standard process for returning goods back into the central warehouses. Some companies don't. If you don't have it, there's a big chance that you're going to have dead or excess stock lying around out in the downstream locations or in the distribution centers. And if you move those back in your supply chain, they basically increase the likelihood that you will be able to use it in other situations. Of course, that has to be evaluated based on the cost of those materials, etc. But Then, so that's returning stock. We also have the ability to, in some cases, just like our clients are being pushed by their customers, then our clients could also push either the customers or the vendors to keep the stock or basically increase their flexibility in when we receive the stock. Yeah, of course, then as we talked about before, we also need to look at the stocking strategies in general. If we have this cap on how much stock value we're allowed to tie up from our boards, then one solution could be to look at targeted decreases of the delivery performance. So basically saying, okay, but these products, we want to be at a 97% service level, but for these targeted products that we only deliver once in a while, then we might reduce both the service levels and thereby the stock that we've tied up.
And I guess it also goes the other way in the sense that we also want to make money. So I guess we can have the situation where we actually want to increase the stock on some items because actually it's a bit of a business case for us.
So it is a rebalancing exercise. Yeah. It's not just a stock sort of reduction exercise.
Yeah.
Yes, and then we have companies where they have a huge amount of backlog orders, and of course, shipping those backlog orders out, depending on what the reason for the backlog, of course, is. If it's because you're missing components, then it's not completely up to you. But basically, we have client examples where they have huge amount of service orders in backlog, and basically just completing those instead of taking new orders in, that's one way to reduce stock, but actually keeping the activity level.
Yeah.
So that's just a few things you could look at when we talk stock balancing. The fifth point we're gonna sort of analyze in a pre-study is basically to go in and do a full analysis of their current footprint. So like we talked about before. Are we producing the right products at the right places? Are we having the right footprint with regard to distribution centers? Where are we putting the decoupling points of the stock to minimize the stock, but have the necessary service level and lead times, etc. So that's also part of the analysis.
Yeah. I guess it's here that once we look at the supply chain footprint, that linking back to I think very interesting around the inventories and the whole stock analysis there, that things come into play that it's hard to change. For instance, goods in transit is a lot that some at least companies struggle with at the moment. I guess you will get that overview when you look at the footprint as well. How can we in time adapt maybe to avoid some of these situations that we're in at the moment?
Yes, that will be part of the footprint analysis, and sometimes the footprint analysis also,
Yeah. So, but good. So we made the analysis. Now we have we know where.
So that was a complicated point number 2 with a lot of subpoints. But the third point is basically trying to all of these outputs from the analysis covering the five functional areas. And just to reiterate, we have the demand planning improvements. We have understanding of our vendor delivery performance. We have our delivery performance against our customers. And we have the whole stock balancing exercise. And finally, the focus on the footprint. Those are the 5 areas of analysis. Then the third main point is that we go into the business case and try to formulate all the findings we've come across during the pre-study. We'll capture that in a business case, both to capture the high-level performance figures as they are right now, but the pre-study will also have sort of indicated what the potentials are. And this is both the theoretical potentials, but also the real potentials. So basically saying, well, our optimal stock levels might be at 300 million euros, and currently we're at 400 million. That would be the theoretical optimum, and then a range of reasons why that gap of 100 million is there. So trying to capture that in a business case format, so you know exactly before you start on the roadmap, this 4-5 year roadmap to improve your supply chain, you know exactly what your baseline is and what you're moving against theoretically.
Yeah, and I guess this is a point that you that even though that you as a as a person might want to skip it, you're probably not allowed to, because once you want to set this transformation, every C-level you're going to touch upon will ask for this to some extent. What kind of transformation and what do we get out of it? What are the pains we're solving? So you need this step, I guess.
Yeah. Then if we move into the fourth point, which is also an output from the pre-study, which again, I reiterate, is a very detailed exercise. It's not a long, from a calendar point of view, not a long exercise, but it's a very detailed output you get from that pre-study. The fourth exercise is, fourth output is basically analyzing the current supply chain maturity. So analyzing your organizational maturity with regard to supply chain management. And that is basically split into two sections, saying we need to focus on what's our current capabilities on our people and organizational side, and what's our capability with regard to solutions and processes. So those two, you will get a clear picture out of just doing the basic pre-study as it is. What's our ability of our own people to actually keep track of what's happening during that process? That will tell us something about their maturity level. Communicating between the different functional areas during the pre-study will tell us, okay, what's our organizational maturity? How well are they receiving the conclusions? How well are they playing sort of in that process? But also, as I stated before, on the solutions and processes side, we will get a very good picture of what's our ability to generate the necessary data output to do the analysis, and what's our ability to analyze that data. So we will get a very good picture of the current supply chain maturity, and then also have, of course, an idea of the gap towards the
Yeah, and I guess also the input to, let's say we decide on this transformation, then most would do some kind of implementation roadmap. You need that information in there, because that, of course, will guide how we implement this. Yeah.
And that comes into point number 6, which is basically the final, you could say, the final output from this whole process is very basically defining, based on the pre-study, defining the vision, which leads to defining the strategy, which leads to defining the high-level roadmap. And I stress that it's a high-level roadmap. We don't want to do a long 100-page strategy paper describing each initiative in detail, because our point number 7 is you need to get started on the journey. And doing a lot of detailed analysis on how all the different initiatives are linked, etc., that's simply going to lead to the risk of even further paralysis, of not wanting to move ahead, because there's so many things that are wrong and where we're going to start, etc. So the important thing is that you have the high level roadmap of these initiatives, and then you pick very pragmatically pick the ones that make sense to start on, and then get started.
I think that's very sound advice at the last point. I think just to elaborate a little bit about why we have this just get started, I guess it's also because in our experience, you can have the best laid plan for this, the most detailed plan within this area. Yeah. And 3 months down the road, you get wiser on some of the points, and you need that flexibility to make the best decision, not the ones in the pretty PowerPoints, but you need the flexibility to make the right decision and not the decision you planned for. So
exactly, because as we've stated multiple times, also in the previous podcast, I mean, the reality is going to change. I mean, that's the whole point of this, that if the supply chain focus changes 6 months down the road, corresponding to this 90-degree turn, the same thing is going to happen to your strategy, or at least the prioritization of your different strategic initiatives are going to change completely, maybe every year at least.
But I think a hugely interesting 7 points here. But maybe as a final point, we're conducted now the 7 points. We're ready to go. Just a few points from your perspective. What can companies gain from this making this transformation? In your, what are you looking at the moment?
I mean, the main point is that, as we talked about in the previous podcast, is, I mean, all of what we're talking about here is basically increasing the organization's ability to execute your supply chain decisions. Mm-hmm. So making that more efficient or even manageable, because as we also talked about before, some organizations are simply not able to steer the ship steer the organization 90 degrees if they wanted to. So they simply don't have the capability. But so simply introducing that capability, but then also do it efficiently. That's what they'll get out of it. Mm. And that would be true even if we were driving down the straight road, as I said in the beginning, or as it is right now, that it seems like we're jumping from crisis to crisis, which is the reality.
So the basic message, carry out these 7 steps. Make sure you have the basics right, because these 7 steps will actually make sure that your desired business outcome from the company is balanced with your supply chain outcome afterwards.
Yes.
And then get started, as you said. I think very, very good input, Stefan. Thank you very much for that. I think time is running out for this podcast. I think final point from me here that a viewer or a listener could be wondering is listening to these 7 steps. Oh no, this is taking a year and a half. I think just wanted to make the point that this should be able to be done in 4 to 6 weeks. Yes. If you set your mind to it. So it's not a huge, complex thing to do this homework or this preparation here. But the consequences of not doing it can be quite severe in our opinion. So I think that's also a valid point to have here in the end. But thank you very much to you, Stefan, and for you listening out there. Thank you for joining in today here. I hope you found some good inspiration in these 7 steps. If you want to hear more about us or Perito Consulting, check out our website or reach out to us. We are more than happy to talk about how this could be in your organization. But other than that, thank you for tuning in and have a great day out there.